Hi everyone. In the position shown, white has played the Queen's Gambit. When he put his pawn on c4, notice the pawn is undefended. So black can take it, and if he does so, that's called the Queen's Gambit accepted. And that is the subject of this video today. Now, when white played c4 in this position, he's trying to entice the black pawn to leave its central post on d5 so that nothing is defending e4 anymore. And this allows white to expand in the center with a move like e2 to e4. All right, so that's the purpose of the Queen's Gambit, to try to dislodge black's center pawn. So you may wonder, is it a good idea for black to do this? Well, it's a very valid way to play. You can find top-level games in the database, even in the last few years, where this has been played. And the reason black may want to play this is that when you play the Queen's Gambit declined, e6, then you're blocking in your light squared bishop, and you're defending your d5 pawn with another pawn. And this is going to cause you to be in a defensive posture. You're always going to be defending d5, trying to hold on to that strong point. And that's going to limit your development possibilities, the way you can place your pieces. You always have to think about that strong point on d5. So when you accept the gambit, then you no longer have to nurse that point anymore, and you're free to develop in many different ways. So, and your light squared bishop is not blocked in. So that's why sometimes black decides to go ahead and abandon the center and let white have it in order to get more freedom for his pieces. All right, so what should we do if we face the Queen's Gambit accepted? Well, I recommend playing the move e3 and not pushing that all the way to the center e4. Now, e4 is actually more popular, and you can play that and try to study it if you want to, but we're going to look at e3 in this video. The reason we're going to look at e3 is twofold. One, the e-pawn now defends the d4 pawn. So if black plays a move like e5 or c5 to attack our d-pawn, and he tries to take it, we're ready to take back with a pawn and keep a pawn on d4. Which, by the way, would open up our dark squared bishop, which we just blocked in with e3. It's not bad to block in this bishop. It's not permanently blocked in. This pawn is free to move again later. It's not blockaded by another pawn on e4. So it's a temporary situation with that being blocked in. Another reason we play e3 is a tactical reason. It actually makes it easier for us to recover the c4 pawn. So we're going to try to win that back. And you'll see in a few moments why that's the case. All right, so what does black play after e3? Well, looking at the database, the top three moves for black are knight to f6, just developing, centralizing the knight, makes sense. Also e5, putting the pawn in the center, attacking the d4 pawn. Even though that's black's own gambit of a pawn here, white really doesn't want to take that pawn though, because black does pretty good after exchanging queens, displacing the white king so he can't castle anymore, and then playing knight c6 next, attacking that e5 pawn. And he gets very quick development, and it's actually hard for white to stay ahead a pawn in the position. White can easily take this now, but if he does at this point, black can take back on e5 and attack the bishop on c4. So it's not the way white would actually play if faced with e5. The third most popular move for black in this position is e6. So we'll look at all three of those, knight f6, e6, e5, in separate videos. But in this video, I want to discuss what happens if black tries to defend the c4 pawn, which we are currently attacking with our light squared bishop. So it's a natural question. If you're new to this opening, you may wonder, why doesn't black just defend the pawn and try to remain a pawn up in this Queen's Gambit? Well, let's see, how can black defend that pawn? So a few ways to do it. He may play bishop to e6 to defend it, but that suffers from the obvious drawback of blocking in the e pawn. So the e7 pawn cannot move forward and participate in the center. So that also cuts down the mobility of the dark squared bishop. And white could expand in the center possibly later with his pawns and attack that bishop. So it just doesn't belong on that square. Okay, another move that protects the pawn is queen to d5. Not a great idea to bring your queen out in the middle of the board early, especially if you can attack it, and white can immediately get a tempo with knight to c3. So it turns out to be too difficult to use a piece like a bishop or queen to defend that pawn. So the other way to defend it, which is the subject of this video, is b5. That's the move I really want to focus on. That's the move most people would point out. If you're new to this opening, you would say, okay, go ahead and play b5. That looks like a strong way to defend the c4 pawn. So the light squared bishop now is just looking directly at this pawn chain. Pawn chain is when you have two or more pawns arranged on a diagonal like this. So it's a little small pawn chain. So what do we do if we face this? Well, we have to break up the pawn chain. And the way you break up a pawn chain is you attack the base of the pawn chain. The base is the rearmost pawn, the b5 pawn in this case. And the reason you want to attack that is if you can eliminate the base of the pawn chain, then the head of the pawn chain would have no protection. And then you can take off the head. So we're going to attack b5 with the move a4. All right, so we're threatening to take the pawn on b5 and then play bishop takes c4. So what can black do about this? Well, there were actually a few dozen games in the Masters database that reached this position, although it's extremely rare. Black does not normally want to play b5 because of this move a4. But nevertheless, this was reached several times, several dozen times, a few dozen times in the database. So what did black do? Well, in all of those games, in every single game, black played b4 here. And he gave up the c4 pawn anyway. So he was only planning on temporarily defending it. White can go ahead and take that pawn at his leisure now on c4. So why does black do this? Well, maybe because that pawn on b4 is taking away the c3 square, so it makes it harder to develop this knight. So he's trying to just gain some space with this pawn and use it as a nuisance, making it harder for white to develop. And I'll get back to that move in just a few minutes here. But before we look at that, suppose black is stubborn and wants to continue to protect his pawn chain and doesn't want to lose a pawn. What can he do? Well, maybe he can defend b5 with one of these two pawns. Well, let's look at each possibility. If he plays a6 in this position, then there's a problem because we take on b5 anyway. And notice now the pawn on a6 is actually pinned. Black cannot take back as intended because he would lose his rook. So a6 doesn't defend anything, actually. Well, what about c6? Doesn't that adequately defend b5? Well, let's take a look. White should take on b5, and black seems like he can recapture. But the problem here is the move queen to f3, attacking the rook down the diagonal. And this explains one of the reasons why we played e3 rather than e4. So we don't have the pawn on e4 blocking the queen here. And black is going to lose material. he can't successfully block up this diagonal. The best he can do is give away one of his minor pieces in order to save his rook. For example, he can try knight c6, we take the knight, bishop d7 to block the check, and now the queen is defending the rook. But black had to give up a whole minor piece in order to defend that c4 pawn. So that didn't work either. And there are other moves you might consider here that just don't work. I don't want to get into every possibility. We don't want to spend all of our effort on all of these strange ways that black may attempt to defend his pawn. For example, bishop d7 may come to mind here to defend that. It just does not work out so well, and I'll give you a sample line. I won't analyze everything, but white can take on b5, and if black takes back to continue to defend the c-pawn, then we can play knight c3, attacking the bishop. Maybe black defends it this time with the c-pawn, playing c6, and in this case, the idea of knight takes b5 and c takes b5 doesn't work out for white. This is no longer a threat on the diagonal because white can protect the rook by moving the knight out of the way to d7. So that's not how white would proceed if faced with c6. Instead, he should play b3 and attack the c4 pawn. And there are different moves here that black could try, but let's take a look at c takes b3. Well, now there are two pieces that are attacking the bishop on b5, so white can successfully take on b5, win the pawn on b5 with check, and then pick off the b3 pawn. And white has won his material back. The material is equal, but white has better development and a better center, 2-to-1 pawns in the center. So it's just simply not working out for black to try to defend this pawn chain here after the move a4. So that's the move you really want to remember if black tries to build this little pawn chain. So let's go back to this move b4. Just out of curiosity, you probably won't face this since it's so rare. It's a rare idea to push to b5. It looks like an attempt to defend the pawn, and then you just push it forward and you're no longer defending that pawn. Well, let's look at one of the master games in the database. I found a game that was very good. It was a Grandmaster Lupulescu played the white pieces in the Tal Memorial Blitz tournament in 2019. So we'll take a look at this game, and instead of taking on c4 immediately, white threw in this move queen to f3, which I thought was a very useful intermediate move, attacking the rook on a8. And the reason that's a useful move is the only way to defend the rook is with c6. And so that kind of stops black from developing the knight naturally to c6. Then white took the pawn on c4. Black played knight f6. Knight f6 blocked a mate there, by the way. Did you notice that? The queen and the bishop are lined up like in a scholar's mate against, I guess it's not a mate. There's an escape square here, but it's a threat on the f7 pawn. So black blocked that. And now black may want to play bishop to g4 next, since the knight is supporting that square, attacking the queen. So that's why white played h3, controlling the g4 square. Okay, then e6, opening up the dark squared bishop. Knight e2, can't develop the knight to f3, so it's got to go to e2. Queen c7 was played. e4, grabbing the whole center and opening up the dark squared bishop. Bishop b7, fianchettoing the bishop. Bishop f4, attacking the queen. Queen has to move. Notice you cannot play bishop to d6 here because you have a pawn fork, e5. So the queen had to move. It moved to c8. White castled. Bishop e7. Knight d2. The knight couldn't go to c3, but white's getting developed very successfully here. He's got a very strong center. Bishops are ideally placed. So white's getting a great position. Knight b d7, rook f c1, black castled. a5 is a threat to push the pawn to a6 and attack the bishop, which would be trapped. It has nowhere to move. So black thwarts that with a6 himself. Knight g3 was played. Rook d8. And now a very instructive move, e5. Looks a little strange to give up the d5 square that the pawn is currently defending and to create a backward d-pawn like this. But white wants to attack the black king. He already has 3 pieces over here on the king side. And this is often a useful move to fix the pawn on e6 and to kind of split the black forces in half here. And this pawn chain is pointed towards the king side, and we can get our pieces over in this direction behind that pawn chain. So we can attack in the direction the pawn chain is pointing. Black tried knight d5 here. I think probably a more stubborn defense was knight to e8, defending the g7 square, which may come under attack very soon. But knight d5 was played instead. All right, after knight d5, white takes the knight off the board. The knight was threatening the dark squared bishop, which makes a good attacker against the black king. And then e takes d5. And white no longer has to worry about the backward pawn or the weak d5 square. Black has filled it in with a pawn. Okay, queen g4, putting pressure on g7. And bishop f8 was an attempt to defend that square before it's even attacked. Knight f5 attacks it for a second time, so it's pre-defended. But white is actually making a threat in the position other than putting pressure on g7. Do you see white's threat here? So white is threatening actually knight to h6 check because there's a pin on the pawn, and after the king is forced to h8, then there's knight takes f7 check, forking the king and the rook. So there's that threat in the position. So black steps aside with king h8, so there's no more pin on the pawn. So knight to h6 would be met by g takes h6. Knight f3 getting another piece into the attack, bringing the pieces all toward the king side. g6, knight h6, again threatening knight takes f7 check. So the bishop takes the knight, bishop takes h6. Black is weak on the dark squares because he pushed his g-pawn to g6. So white would love to get his queen in here to the g7 square for a mate. Okay, knight f8 was played. Queen h4, threatening to play queen f6 check. Then the king is forced to g8, and then there's a mate on g7. So queen f5 defends that square. Okay, but then bishop g5, attacking the rook and maybe maneuvering the bishop over to f6 and getting the queen in this way. All right, black played knight d7 to defend that square, I suppose, just leaving his rook to be taken. And then white took the rook, and black actually resigned. He had enough at this point. He's given up material. So I don't know if that was a blunder, but it was a blitz game. But if we go back here, after white attacked the rook, you can ask yourself what happens if he moves the rook. Well, then bishop f6 check would come, king g8, queen h6 with a threat of a mate on g7, and the only way to defend that other than giving up the queen is knight to f6, or knight to e6 rather, to defend the g6 square, the g7 square. But white has a finishing move here to insist upon that checkmate. Do you know what it is? Okay, the move would be knight g5, attacking that knight, and black cannot take because of the mate here. So you want to attack the only defender of that square. So the only way to stave off mate would be if black gives up his queen in this position. There's even a threat here of queen takes h7, followed by queen takes f7 mate. So black would lose here anyway. All right, so a very strong attack by Grandmaster Lupulescu in this particular opening. So we're going to continue to study the Queen's Gambit, accept it, and we're going to look at better replies by black. But just to recap, so after he accepts, we're going to play e3. We're going to keep this diagonal clear. We're going to support the d4 pawn. And today we looked at the inferior move, b5. So if you see that, attack the base of that pawn chain, and you're either going to win your material back, or black's going to twist himself up in knots trying to save it. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you for the next part in the series.